Hey guys, my name is Nick and welcome back to the channel and welcome to part 3 and the final part of painting this Forgeworld Contemptor Dreadnought, the Osiron variant. What you're seeing on the screen is the catch up from last time we'd completed all of the blue paintwork, and in this video we are going to be going through all of that final detail. Be warned, it is a little bit long because there is a lot of detail to cover, and I'm trying to get through this in a logical fashion, and you can see all the steps as we go through it. So without further ado, let's get straight into the video. Hope you noticed the slightly refreshed new intro there. It was pointed out that the Union flag was upside down and it's been like that for 3 years. Anyway, moving swiftly on, the first thing we're going to do is all of the gold trim, and we're going to start off with Retributor armor from Games Workshop. There is a lot of trim on pretty much every Chaos model in the range, and the Osiron is no exception really. So there is a lot of trim around the legs, around the top of the thigh sections, and a fair bit on the torso. So a small, a thin, even layer. Probably takes about 2 coats to go smoothly over the blue. Just depends on how thickly you apply it and how smoothly you apply it. For me, this took sort of 2-ish coats, 1.5, 2-ish thin coats to go all the way around on the gold. So there's plenty of gold trim, so I'm just going to show you the areas that I'm going to be applying it to. Then I'll go off camera, complete it, and then come back and show you where the completed sections are. One of the things here is the big chest detail here. I nearly called it an eagle then, but clearly that would be Imperial. It's just the chest detail going on there. Just making sure you get it in between all of the scroll work and all of the nice drapes that this guy's got. There is plenty of gold to go round. And while you've got that gold paint out, don't forget to do any weapons that you've got. If you've bought multiple different weapon options, there's going to be some gold on there, no doubt, as well. So make sure you get those pieces covered too. Once all the gold is done, as you can see here, that is a couple of thin coats to make sure that really sticks out. You can see all the leg trim there, the thigh or top of thigh trim, and then of course we've got the different arms for the 2 shoulder mounts here, and we've got the torso as well. And there's a little bit of bling gold around where the headpiece goes, a little bit on the head as well. The head's not separate on this model compared to the regular Contemptors. It is integrated, and then of course we've got the trim around the edge on the upper arms, and that little bit of replicated chest detail that is actually repeated onto the big arm there. Next up then, my standard recipe for gold is Retributor armor shaded with Reikland Fleshshade. So we're going to go straight in, neat Reikland Fleshshade with a controlled brush, and we're just going to apply that all over the gold trim that we've already done. Really focus on the recesses and any rivets and so on, because it will pull nicely around the rivet to give it some depth and detail. GW do a very similar approach to this, I believe, but we're just going to go around and do the same. Reikland Fleshshade over gold is a really good way of shading it. And don't forget, once again, all of the other components of your gold trim that you've done, so keep them handy whilst you've got that paint out. With the detail on this model, there's no real specific order to actually complete it in. It's whatever suits you best, whatever you can multitask with or concurrent activity while paint's drying. So for example, now I'm going in with the Leadbelcher or Gunmetal from Vallejo. Leadbelcher will do from Games Workshop as well. And we're going to paint in all sort of the mechanical moving parts, so all of the pivot points, all the hinges, the knee joints, the hip joints and so on, and some of the engine and back detail as well. So the power plant of the model. So I'm just going to go through that all with Leadbelcher / Gunmetal, and that's pretty much it. That's the metallic sort of interior design, the mechanical part of the model. There's no real logic to it. It's personal preference. If you like the box art or the Forgeworld website artwork, you can always look at that. There's some good 360 views of a lot of their models now, but it's personal preference where you feel this is going to go. So the ball and socket joints for me seem appropriate, as does sort of that engine exhausty piece that's around the back of the hips here. I'm going to paint that into the metal colour as well, and just a few other sections as we go through. Looking on the torso piece then, we've got the upper arm receiver socket joints here. I'm going to paint those in that same metallic style. So I'm just going to go around those with gunmetal as well. Now, as you know, I've been also painting a Vindicator just to show you the same techniques applied to a different type of chassis. So this is a bit of an interlude to the Contemptor, and you can see here I'm going to apply some yellow and blue stripes to the Vindicator model. It doesn't have a huge amount of detail if you don't have the old school Forgeworld doors, for example, that came out many years ago. I don't have those. Bit of a recovery model. So all I've done is mask off the entire model and apply those stripes. And I'm using Tamiya yellow, flat yellow for this. I think it's a great colour. I've used it on many models, straight over black. A couple of coats, it goes lovely over black. And again, any over dark colours as well. So blue, for example. So while I'm painting the Contemptor, this is the opportunity while paint dries, or you want a quick break from that model because you've been staring at the same thing for many hours now. Having another model on the go that you're still sharing the colour palette with, but giving you something else to progress at the same time, is really handy for your motivation. So I wanted to paint this in the same colour scheme, whilst I've still got the paints mixed, or the paints out for the Osiron, just for that added challenge, or added unit addition to the forces while I'm going on. It saves remixing paints, for example, especially when you're doing the blue transitions. So if you're doing Chaos Predators or Rhinos or Vindicators the same as this, you can apply very similar techniques. I'm just highlighting up the yellow. So the same Tamiya flat yellow, I've added a tiny bit of white to it, and then just airbrushing that gently across the middle just to give it a bit of variation in that colour. And once you remove all of the masking, this is what you end up with. It's not a bad result. It's not perfect. You can see the yellow has actually gone onto the black tracks, but the detail for those tracks hadn't been finished, so nothing overly to worry about. Now, talking of while we've got some of these colours on the go, this is what I'm going to be using, that Tamiya flat yellow, for the Osiron's headpiece to make sure that is yellow as well. So, as with the airbrush, I'm going to use a regular brush here with a bit of control, and paint in every other stripe in the headdress. So we're going to have a yellow, blue, yellow, blue. Exactly the same as like your Rubrics or your Scarab Occult, for example. That's the same colour that I've used for that. So be very careful to try and pick this out. It's quite difficult to try and get in between some of that detail, but the net result is that that yellow is now applied. Now, we can now go back to the metallic pieces. Now we're going to use a bit of liquid talent here in the form of Nuln Oil, and all we're going to do is give that a full wash over all of the silver pieces that we painted a few minutes ago, which actually is probably about 2 days ago for me at the moment because of the magic of editing, and leaving that to dry. And we're just going to go over neat with liquid talent. With that Nuln Oil dry, we can now move on to some more details. Now, again, always look at the model and always look at the pieces that you can apply the same colour to over and over again. So you've only got to open the paint up once and just get that done across all of the bits of model. So we're now going to move on to neutralise some of these colours, ready for either cloth or Basilicanum Grey, which is a contrast paint that I'm going to be using to paint in these shoulder details with all the runes or the inscriptions or the hieroglyphs or the cartouches, whichever you want to call them. Look up your Egyptology history. So I'm going to paint these in Karak Stone. You can use something like Grey Seer, which is the contrast standard base colour, but I felt this was a nice little bit darker and saved me opening up my nearly dried out Grey Seer paint. So again, this is personal preference. I believe the box art has some glowing runes on this, but you can pick and choose your colour of choice for detail here. But for cloth and any of the sort of the scroll work that is all over the model, all I'm doing is just trying to neutralise the blue before we paint any other colours over it. So that's the only reason I'm doing it on certain aspects. But for the scroll work, this will form the main solid base coat for the way I'm going to be painting those. So all of the scroll work, all of those shoulder joints, and any sort of cloth and ribbony type material that we've got, that's going to get a coat of Karak Stone. So just going back to the torso here, we've got a little bit of scroll work in the middle there that we can just cover just below the head. And then we've got two big long streamers that come down here. Now remember I separated these in the build because trying to build that model with two streamers hanging out of him would have been a pain. So they are painted separately towards the end. So once all that Karak Stone, again, that took two thin coats actually to get that to work. We can now shade the scroll work only with Seraphim Sepia. So, and then the shoulders, as I mentioned, Basilicanum Grey contrast paint. So we're going to do the shoulders first. All I'm going to do is actually 2 coats I apply for this, neat out of the pot, but you do want to work the paint around so that it doesn't dry and overly pool in the places you don't want it to. So you want it to dry in all the runes and the hieroglyph areas, but not anywhere else. And that will give it the natural highlight and shade. Now with all the scroll work and all of that kind of stuff and these nice little drapes, Seraphim Sepia is your friend. So I'm just going to apply that again, a fairly neat but controlled amount on the brush. And we're just going to go across all of that Karak Stone that we've done, really making sure that it does, again, run into the recesses. Concurrent activity while that's drying, we're out with the Brassy Brass from Vallejo, or any Dwarven Brass, anything from GW that matches is fine. As usual, I'll leave a full colour guide in the description below with your translated paints from Vallejo to GW. The brass on this is just the exhaust vents on the power pack on the back. And there's a couple of details that I tend to do in brass on the weapon arms, but you've probably seen that on any of the other models that I've done before. There's actually a couple of other details in amongst the head. There's a lot of cable work going on just in between the head. And all I'm going to do is just go back with that gunmetal / Leadbelcher and paint that in. Couldn't do it on camera because it's quite finicky work and required a really small brush and my eyeballs aren't great. But yeah, just go in there with that and then shade with Nuln Oil exactly as you did before. And I've added an extra coat of Agrax EarthShade over it, especially over the other pieces as well, just because Chaos doesn't have shiny metal. It has a bit more rusted metal in my opinion. So we're going to add an extra bit of depth and an extra bit of tone with Agrax EarthShade. That's liquid talent number 2. Beyond Nuln Oil. Nuln Oil the return. So yeah, any of those metallic parts that we've already shaded up, we're just going to add Agrax to. So we can now see it's still not glued together, so don't worry about that. But we can still see, just want to give yourself a bit of confidence that there is progress being made, especially when you're painting it in sections. Now, as I come to do this, there's more pieces down on this leg that I completely forgot to do. So we need to go and look at those cartouches on the leg as well. And all I'm going to do is exactly the same as I did on the shoulders. That's Karak Stone, Basilicanum Grey, and crack on and just match those 2 pieces together. You could, if you really wanted to, introduce another colour at this point as a spot colour. But I've got a couple of other colours for the power weapon and the sort of energy glow on the top of the headdress that I'm going to introduce with a green shade. And also the cloak in his middle, on his torso, I'm going to go with purple, so I didn't want to introduce another colour personally at that section. But all I did was just go through 2 coats of Karak Stone, the same as the shoulder blades, and then we're just going to go over with Basilicanum Grey just to shade that back in, the same as the shoulder mounts. With the Basilicanum Grey done, that's the net effect. I'm not really going to do any more to that. I'm just going to leave it contrast doing a contrast thing, shading and highlighting in one go. All the other colours are now dry though, and we're now going to lightly dry brush back with gunmetal over our shaded metallic parts. I use a makeup brush for a dry brush. I bought 7 makeup brushes off of Amazon for about £6.50. That's about just under $10. Super cheap, super soft. If they get trashed, you're not going to cry about it because they're not 15 quid a brush. But they really, really do work. If you've got a partner who wears makeup, when they've finished with their makeup brushes, before they're going to throw them away, acquire them. They're great for weathering with as well on vehicles. Don't forget all your other metallic parts as well, like the claws on this fist, and a second coat or a second highlight stage with a brighter silver. I've got a chainmail silver that I've used for a second coat. That's all the metallic work done. We're now going to go back and look at all of the scroll work. So we're going to go back with Karak Stone. Remember, this was Karak Stone and Seraphim Sepia to shade it. We're now going to layer over with Karak Stone again, just to bring that original colour back and leave that shade in the recess. Go with a slightly thinner coat of this, is my recommendation. It makes it look a bit more natural. Still leave some of the shade behind. And you can be a bit clever with how you do this. You could just paint in sort of the top sections and leave some of that shade below on the flat section to give it some artificial definition. or you can just flat paint it back in. Before we move on to highlighting with bone and with white, I've taken some like a granite colour. I think actually this colour was Storm Vermin Fur, as I'm referring to my paints below. And all I've done is just dab a bit of that on with some sponge. Adds a little bit of worn effect to your scroll work. It makes it look a bit more ornate, a bit more worn out. It's actually a Forgeworld technique from one of their masterclasses. I've used it on Titans before. Trying to apply it to a smaller area though is a bit more tricky, so you do need tweezers and a small bit of sponge. Once that's done though, we're going to highlight up all around the edges with bone or bleach bone, or just a very light, pale, creamy white. Going to do that on all of the other cloth work, so you can see there the drapes that are hanging around, and on that arm section as well that's got a bit more scroll work, and that completes those sections there. We can highlight up with a little bit of white, as you can see on that lower leg piece there. As much detail as you want to, or depending on your own skill level and how far you want to take the model. Still got a few more details on the legs to go. We've still got some more gold sections that we can come back in. I didn't paint them gold originally, thinking I might go with a emerald kind of style for the scarabs, but decided to go back with gold. So this next step then, we're going to paint in the cloth, the loincloth section. We're going to go with a purple to, a purpley blend, and that matches all of the psychers in my Thousand Suns army. Again, personal preference if you want to go red or grey or whatever matches the rest of your army. So this is the reason why I wanted to neutralise the blue, because a thin, even though it's a base coat colour, it's actually quite a thin pigmented colour from Vallejo. I think GW's Screamer Pink or Emperor's Children Pink is very similar in its formula. So again, you could contrast paint that if you really wanted to, but I'm going to go with a traditional kind of blended paint job. While that's drying then, we've got a couple of other details still on the head section still to cover. And I've Karak Stoned in sort of the drapey bit of robe that's going around that headdress. All I did was Karak Stone that exactly the same as everywhere else. And we've got a couple more shades to apply as well. Now, I didn't actually record the shade on the cloth on the legs, unfortunately. But that was you saw the colours there, Carroburg Crimson and a little bit of black mixed together to shade that down, and I've left that on its side so that it dries in the recesses, rather than if you let it upright it will pool at the bottom. So a couple of bits to go on the headdress then. So over that Karak Stone sort of rope section that's dangling down, I've gone over with Nasdreg Yellow contrast, and that turns it into a different type of gold from the other paints. And then around the, there's two sections of this. There's one on the shin on the left leg here, or the right as you're looking at it. I'm going over with Iyanden Yellow contrast paint. This gives a couple of different variations of yellowy gold across the model, so it's not all exactly the same. Right, next section. This is where we're going to add a different colour into the model, and I'm going with a green glow effect on his Osiron blade. And I've got several different colours here, from a heavy black green, dark green, goblin green, and a scorpion green. Again, as usual, I'll leave colour translations to GW colour schemes in the description below. Now, I've taken the blade, which, if you remember from the assembly video, is completely separate in order to be able to paint it separately. And I've pinned it so that I can actually get some control over it. From a black prime, then, we're going to use Vallejo's heavy black green, or heavy green black. And we're going to airbrush in the leading edge all the way up to just about where the riser point, the central point of the blade actually is, but not all the way to the top. It depends how good your airbrush skills are. And there's several different ways to do this. You could have done, you know, a sort of a multi-transitional blade if you wanted to, down each side with all that masking and everything else that comes with that. It just depends on your personal preference. You could paint it in a single mono colour and maybe varnish it up. Satin varnish would look good on a blade like this. But I think my airbrush skills are above average, and they're not superb, to get a different, you know, sort of 3 or 4 colour transition on this thin blade. So we're now moving on to a darker green. I think we're actually just we're bypassing the dark green because I realised it didn't actually do a huge amount to the blade. We're going to go straight to Goblin Green. And then again, we're going to airbrush, which is very carefully concealed by the hopper on the airbrush gun. You can see the result. You've got to be super careful. Make sure the paint is flowing nicely. You'll see the effect in a second. A controlled blitz around the edge of that blade, and as I sort of twinkle it in the light, you can see that it still leaves some of the heavy green above it, and you're just transitioning that to the top. This camera angle is dreadful. I apologise profusely. But you can see the colour transition. Once I take away the airbrush, you can see the colour transition from black to the dark green to the lighter green. And I'm just doing the very tip of the weapon as well, just because it's got a little crook on the end of it. But you can see exactly what's happened, I hope. I hope you can see what happened. That is such a bad camera angle. I need to work on top-down effects and maybe some side camera angles, but it's a very cramped space in this studio, unfortunately. Airbrushing means paint dries super quick, so we can move on to the Scorpion Green. You can see where I've blown it onto the newspaper on my desk there. And we're just going to lightly airbrush the very, very edge, super controlled. You can see that transition already there at the very tip. And just airbrush that very gingerly onto the edge to give it that glow effect right on the end. And you can see that as I move it around in the lightbox light there, the airbrush booth light, you can see exactly what's happened. Again, you don't have to take it to this stage. I just think it's a nice little extra stage. If you've got that control on your airbrush, brace yourself with all your hands, make sure everything is nice and steady, and you can see that little tinge come out nicely. Now we're going to take that final airbrush colour, the Scorpion Green, and a bit of white, and we're going to just highlight up with a brush the very edges of all the weapons and all the sort of the run-off points, using the side of the brush for the added control. This will just give it that final pop layer, just to give it that extra detail. Again, this is a step you don't have to do if you don't want to. I do find it quite difficult to do some of those risen edges on blades. I don't know if you know that one that's running down the centre of that blade in the curve. Very, very difficult to get that spot on. Professional painters are so much better at this. But the key is the side of the brush, and with fairly fluid paint, but not super liquid, because otherwise it will run. Just use the side of the brush and run it down those sides of the edges there. So I'm just going to go off camera and do that just to give me a bit of better control rather than trying to record it. And you can see I've just done a little bit of the green, and just at the very peaks, the super exposed or the super high points, I'm going to add a bit of white. And then just because I wanted to add some weird sort of electrical sparkles, I've added a little couple of flashes with the white paint. I'm not convinced it's a great effect, but I think it looks a bit alright, because otherwise it looked a bit flat. Again, personal preference. Finally then, with all that dried, we can now glue that back onto the original weapon arm and stick those two together. Regular super glue, I don't think this superly needs pinning. I did just cut out the pin that I had to hold it. You can pin it if you want. There's plenty of room to drill in if you are concerned about that. Right, we can now go back because the shade on the cloth has now dried, and we're going to go back over it with Warlock Purple, which is my Vallejo's Warlord Purple, not Warlock Purple. Apologies. And we're going to then start bringing this back up to a highlighted level. So just going over sort of the flat areas, leaving the recesses with that paint, just bringing it back up to the more standard base coat that we applied, just leaving that shade in all of those recesses. Next up then, we're going to add a little bit of a lighter pink. I've got here Squid Pink, which is the next shade up from Vallejo. I've added that on my wet palette into the Warlord Purple mix. So it's about a 50-50. And this time we are aiming for all of those edge pieces. So all of the super risen detail, and then maybe just some flare in some of those flat areas just to give it a bit of an effect. Finally then, we can go over with pure Squid Pink just on the very tips, on those super high points, especially on those creases right towards the crutch of the model, and along all of the edges as well. And there we go. That is the purple robe complete. Same effect that I use on the rubrics and the scarabs and the exalted sorcerers. If you really want added effect, this is completely optional. You can add a tiny little bit of white to that top peak, especially in the fold of the cloth. Really beginning to come along. We've just got that sort of top section to go. And don't forget, we still need to shape and to add those extra bits of material cloth that are hanging down, which we're going to do in exactly the same way as we've done all of the other cloth sections. So we've got a couple of colours that we're going to use for the next section. First is Waystone Green, I believe it is. It's a technical paint. Waywatcher Green. And I'm just going to apply that into the central ball. I think it's a nice energy colour. It's kind of, you know, the green is reflected on the power weapon. And I'm just going to leave that to dry in the middle there and let it do its technical thing. And I'm going to shade over the yellow with Iyanden Yellow. Now this is an old glaze paint. I still believe it's still produced. Just adds a little bit of depth and shade into that bright yellow that we did earlier. And again, personal preference, but that does match the way that I did my rubrics and all the other yellow striping that I've done on all my other models. Once that Waywatcher Green was done, we can then move on to Nasdreg Yellow again. I was just getting a bit lazy at this point, I'll be totally honest. I really had no idea what colour to paint that surrounding, so I just went with Nasdreg Yellow and let contrast do its thing. It's quite detailed, so I just let that do its thing. To highlight up the green piece then, I've just taken that Scorpion Green that we were using earlier on the blade, added in a little dot in the middle, and then a couple of little lightning strikes off of it. Couldn't do it on camera because it is super fiddly, but trust me, there's a couple of little lightning bolts sort of moving around to make it look very energetic. And inside each of those little bits, I added a spot of white just to make it pop. At this stage then, I've glued the top arms on, I've glued the torso to the legs, the weapon arm is still magnetised, and I've started construction on the base. You can see the PVA glue is still drying on that base. For my lava base tutorial, there is a full video for that. I'll leave a link in the description below. But I wanted to kind of see the basing, just to make sure that the pose fitted on the sort of lava islands that I'm going to be doing. All we need to do is finish off the base and then add a second weapon of choice. And I've just for demonstration, I've got an autocannon. But the base is now finished and we've got a few photographs to look at of the completed model. I've actually found myself a twin heavy bolter, which I'm going to use, again, magnetised exactly the same way as in the build guide. This was the one that I'd originally purchased for this model, but I've just painted that up. It's very simple. It's metal and brass, the same as we've done throughout all of the other stages of the model. So I finished the base up in my standard Thousand Suns colour scheme. And these are the 4 angles with it all complete with that energy blade and sort of the tilting forward kind of pose. The reason this video did take a little bit longer to do was not only was I doing a Vindicator, I was doing another standard Thousand Suns Contemptor with a bit more of a running forward pose. So I did actually paint up in parallel the Vindicator and 2 Dreadnoughts. Why not, as a bonus model, have an extra as well? Painted exactly the same way. That gives me 3 Contemptors now, the Osiron and 2000 Suns standard ones. That's where that autocannon came from. And all magnetised, and we are hot to trot with lots of robot Dusty Boy deathness. All painted the same technique, same styles, and it all fits in just lovely. And just one final picture then to wrap this video up are all 3 Dreadnoughts and the Vindicator, all looking pretty, ready to add to the Thousand Suns for an eventual game one day of 9th edition. If you're still watching at this point, well done, thank you very much. I appreciate it is a long video. We are pushing nearly half an hour on this video. Completely not intentional, but I did want to cover every step on the process. Otherwise I'd feel like I've done you out of the detail and the promise on the series. But yeah, Osiron complete, really happy with the net results. If you want to shape those little bits of dangly cloth, just dip them in hot water, shape to your own content, and then glue them on. And they were painted exactly the same. Now, I've added some decals to these guys, some transfers as well. Pick and choose if you want to add those from the standard Chaos sheet, or if you've got the 30k Thousand Suns ones, that's what I've done on a mix and match. Up to you, personal preference. You don't even need decals if you don't want them, let's be honest. But yeah, that's it. So I've now got 3 Contemptor Dreadnoughts to add to my Thousand Suns and a Vindicator, which I'm looking forward to using. I still have his big dozer blade to do, I'll be honest. The weather has been so bad in the UK, I don't think it stopped raining for about a week. I've not been able to prime it outside, so that's the reason it's not on there. But rest assured, when we eventually get a dry day, I shall be doing it. But I hope you enjoyed this video. I appreciate you sticking around. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy it, learn something new, please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I shall catch you guys on the next video, which hopefully might be a bit shorter. Cheers, guys.